Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. I feel like our fall has begun and we're moving into a new season. And something about new seasons actually is a little invigorating, and I hope that that's the case for you. We are continuing our series on cancel culture. And I have to tell you, it's been a long couple weeks since we had talked about me sharing this morning. And it has been a roller coaster for me to study this phenomena and to dive into what it means and what it looks like. And I have a lot of thoughts on this matter. I actually rewrote my sermon midway through the week just because I've had such a difficult time kind of sifting through all the nuance of this, of what it is. But I have something on my heart that I want to share today. And I think what might be helpful is to start off with a definition. And I think cancel culture, it's, as we've talked in our coffee hours, there's been a little what exactly are we talking about? And when it's mentioned, what are we describing here? And so I wanted to give you this to start. And this is a working definition that I've come up with. Cancel culture is a public phenomenon where public figures are called to be removed from positions of influence, primarily on social media, due to a statement, action, or support of something deemed hateful, racist, phobic, abusive, or bullying. So people use cancel culture as a kind of vigilante justice for behavior that isn't necessarily illegal, unethical, or immoral, but is offensive, ignorant, bullying, or support for those who are. And since no authority exists to curb this behavior, people go online and they take matters into their own hands to rebuke the offender through public shaming and rejection. Today, I want to ask the question, what is a cancellation trying and hoping to accomplish? I read an article this week that said something interesting. It said Democrats, and again, Democrats are associated most with the use of this idea of cancel culture. Democrats are so obsessed with cancel culture that they're even turning on their own and canceling liberals now. And that struck me as an odd statement to make because this perspective shows a complete misunderstanding of the point. Because at the root of this thing, it's not about politics, but it's about behavior. And I went back and I researched the most prominent cancellations of 2019 and 2020, and over 90% of them had to do with someone doing or saying something racist. Now, the others were some form of homophobia, transphobia, or sexual misconduct. And it's oversimplified to maybe say it this way, but more often than not, cancel culture is trying to get us to stop being racist, phobic, and abusive. We've probably all had that encounter with a friend or acquaintance who tried to make a joke that was expressly racist. And when it didn't go over as they intended, they rolled their eyes and tried to save face by saying something like, "Liberal snowflakes can't take a joke." And the problem is, calling someone a liberal snowflake is neither a logical nor appropriate response to feedback about removing hate speech from your vocabulary. Now, while I don't believe anybody should be canceled because of something they did decades ago, like we should all be allowed to grow and learn. But the problem is canceling has moved from a last resort to a first strike. I'm going to tell you more about that a little bit later. When we disagree with people, there is a long list of healthy responses that we can start to employ. And these include things like listening, empathizing, trying to see things from someone's point of view, education on history or where things came from, personal vulnerability about the hurtfulness of their actions, attempts at negotiation, compromise. But when all else fails, when behavior just absolutely will not stop, or when a sense of entitlement or a declaration of free speech is used as a way to justify hateful, hurtful, or offensive speech, what course of action remains? Cancel culture is a collective. We tried to be reasonable, but you just won't listen. And so we're walking away. It's the only leverage that some people believe that they have left. And what's interesting is it's getting results. They're really, really messy results, and they're really, really temporary results. Cancel culture has pissed some people off. It's made some people who genuinely fear punishment think twice about saying or doing something offensive. But what we're starting to see is either the canceled person stops saying or doing the offensive thing, or they own it and they do it with such deep conviction, and they hold the belief that their supporters will protect them through the inevitable outcry. So without offering support for cancel culture, I believe it's a fair question to ask, what are we going to do to reform our culture in the areas of racism, phobia, and sexual misconduct? What is left to say? Now, I don't like cancel culture because fundamentally, I don't believe in violence. And additionally, I don't believe it results in any kind of productive heart change or social reconciliation. But I also realize that there are too many people who think free speech should include consequence-free hate speech. It might be healthier for everyone to have unapologetically racist voices of influence removed from the limelight. But who gets to decide this? This is where the unhealthy side of cancel culture comes in. Now, personally, I've been hit with this particular dead end with my family. 7 years ago, I came out, and it was the hardest thing that I have ever done. My family didn't take the news well, and over the next 2 years, we started a dance of trying to resolve this tension that this reality had created between us. I did my best to start with listening. There was an immense amount of confusion and disappointment from their side, but the truth is listening was really hard, especially when listening to their processing became condemning and preachy. I tried empathy, tried to put myself in their shoes as much as I was able, but empathy became hard because the emotions I was encountering were often angry, they were often afraid, and they were often sad, and that was exhausting. I tried education and to share that experience together. I tried to research and learn all I could, and my advancing education was immensely helpful and liberating to me. But for my family, it was responded to with a hard pass. For 2 years after I came out, I was not able to get any member of my family to read or discuss anything academic related to the topic of my sexuality. I tried encouraging relationships with experts, and while pastors and counselors and mentors and patient friends were immensely helpful to me, there was no interest in forging any of those kinds of relationships from their side. One day I got a phone call and I hit a wall. Another round of rebukes was kind of ramping up, and I had simply said, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Their response was shocked and initially disregarded, and I had to reiterate, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I will let you know when and if I can heal enough to re-engage with you on this topic. I had started to suffer through some almost perpetual and nearly debilitating anxiety, some depression, and the horror that I was facing rejection from my family over this. A couple weeks later, I drafted a letter outlining some boundaries that I needed in place to protect my own heart. And I suggested we follow up with a conversation, and maybe they would do the same, and we could come to the table and try to negotiate some way that we could coexist. And the response I got was, we are not interested, and we cannot agree to any of this. And that was the last time that we spoke about it. So in effect, we essentially canceled each other. It was a last resort for me from years of trying unsuccessfully to find common ground that we could still stand on together. Now, this example that I'm sharing with you is not the same as cancel culture, but I believe at the heart, the foundation of it is really, really similar. So cancel culture, like I said before, has moved from being a last resort to a first strike. Cancel culture at its core is punishment for wrongdoing. It is a collective reprimand from those who feel powerless. But here's the problem. Punishment is an incredibly ineffective way to facilitate heart change. When we are wronged, our natural tendency is to want revenge. We want our offender to feel the same pain that we felt. And there's a sense of righteousness associated with it, a sense of justice must be done. But I want to take a look at what the Bible says about this. Now, there's actually an entire book of the Bible dedicated to the discussion of crime and punishment. And it's the book of Leviticus. It's the third book of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. And the book of Leviticus outlines in painfully specific detail everything from the sacrifices you're to make for various infractions to repayment for wrongs committed. Consider for a second this excerpt from Leviticus. If someone injures a fellow citizen, they will suffer the same injury that they inflicted. Broken bone for broken bone, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The same injury the person inflicted on the other will be inflicted on them. Now, this eye for an eye concept is a commonly used rule of guiding principles, even today, for repayments for wrongs committed. It's clear-cut and it's non-negotiable, and it's an attempt to simplify a social code of conduct and empower society to regulate itself. But like all punishment-based systems, it's rooted fundamentally in fear. While effective to some degree, punishment doesn't inspire us to act righteously and simply threatens us if we act unrighteously. Now, Jesus understood this distinction, and he often dealt with people in a way that was more effective than simply scaring them into good behavior. So take a look at this passage from John 8. Early in the morning, Jesus returned to the temple. All the people gathered around him, and he sat down and taught them. The legal experts and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. Placing her in the center of the group, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to," and I'm going to excerpt here, "punish this woman by stoning her to death. What do you say?" They said this to test him because they wanted a reason to bring an accusation against him. Jesus bent down and wrote on the ground with his finger. They continued to question him, so he stood up and replied, "Whoever hasn't sinned should throw away the first stone." Bending down again, he wrote on the ground. Those who heard him went away one by one, beginning with the elders. Finally, only Jesus and the woman were left in the middle of the crowd. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Is there no one to condemn you?" And she said, "No one, sir." Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, don't sin anymore." In this story in John 8, the religious leaders are actually looking for a way to cancel Jesus. They want to remove him from influence. Too many people are listening to him. And so they brought this test before him. Either Jesus was going to continue his message of mercy, but in effect encouraging sedition by breaking the law, or he was going to expose himself as a hypocrite by preaching one thing and then supporting the law that kind of he was preaching against. This situation shows Jesus' commitment to mercy and grace. And who knows if anyone in the crowd's mind was changed because of this, but he did it anyway. The people were entitled by law to punish this woman, and actually, if you read Deuteronomy, they were entitled to punish this man as well, who is conveniently missing. But ultimately, would this have resulted in any notable change? I spent the last couple weeks in preparation for this talk researching this idea of punishment. And at its core, cancel culture is rooted in the belief that people deserve to be punished for the bad things that they do, the things they say, and the things that they support. People being punished can be cathartic. And I hate to say it, but the reality is sometimes it feels really good to see people who are arrogant and entitled get knocked down a few notches. There's a study done at the University of Iowa and published in the late 90s on the concept of catharsis. And in this study, they directed people who were angry to express that anger by punching a punching bag as they were thinking about the person that made them angry. They had a second group just punch a bag, but say, think about getting healthier, but we want you to be aggressive and punch this thing. And then they had a control group that was told to sit quietly and do nothing until the time was over. The hypothesis behind Freud's catharsis theory is physical activity will act as a cathartic release for emotions, in this case, anger. After a period of time, they asked each group how they felt, and by a wide margin, the group that was in the calmest and healthiest and most rational spot was the control group. Catharsis theory says that emotions need to be drained from our body. And if we can drain them, that we can eliminate them. You've heard things like, I need to vent, or I need to get it out of my system, or I need to cry it out, or I need to punch it out. All of that comes from Freud's original idea of catharsis theory. The authors of this study, however, described a concept called cognitive neo-association theory. And this theory says that our brains are wired to make connections between ideas. And the longer that we feel an emotion, the more associations that our brain makes to similar instances from our past that made us feel the same emotion. So their conclusion was, contrary to popular belief, we think back to these people that were punching the punching bag, expressing an emotion like anger actually makes us feel more angry and keeps us angry longer. Does that make sense? Now, I don't want to devalue this idea of, like, sometimes you have to verbally process, sometimes you do, it's healthy to get it out of your system. But I want to note that cancel culture is often rooted in an indignation and in an anger. And a lot of times we think that getting it out of our system is what's going to help us feel better. I found a lot of articles that reinforced this conclusion of neo-association theory, and almost none that continued to support the catharsis theory today. Cancel culture gives us a sense of relief from this tension. We believe that someone deserved to be punished for what they did, even if they were already prosecuted by the law. And when they finally were, we feel as if justice has been done. But the question is, does it actually get us what we want? The problem is that punishment has very little long-term value, because punishment doesn't change hearts. It regulates behavior through fear. Now, I want to clarify a couple things. Punishment is not the same as consequences, accountability, or justice. Consequences are when the retribution fits the offense itself. It's when somehow you are making amends on the same grounds that the offense was committed. So punishment would be, well, I'll get you examples later. Accountability is the preservation of our shared values. Accountability says we agreed to live at this level and by this standard, and we need to double check and make sure that that's happened. And justice is the idea that wrongs are righted. I actually asked myself the question, can you have justice without punishment? And I actually want to challenge you to think about that idea. So my point is, sometimes we can use punishment as a way to vent our frustrations. We can dehumanize an offender and feel good about the pain inflicted on them through punishment, believing that just like catharsis purges emotions, pain purges negative desires. But I want to remind you what the Apostle Paul said in Romans. All that passing laws against sin did was produce more lawbreakers. But sin didn't and doesn't have a chance in competition with the aggressive forgiveness we call grace. When it's sin versus grace, grace wins hands down. I want you to hear a story of a community right here in Kansas City that challenged this idea of punishment for me and replaced it with something a little different. I'm going to invite my friend Katie Zeeck to come on and share a story from her school where she teaches and how this impacted students and their community around them. So Katie, I'm going to invite you up. and tell us a little bit about your experience.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jimmy. For those of you who I have not had the chance to meet, our name is Katie Zeeck. We've been a member at Second since 2013, and I'm a teacher at Southeast High School here in the Kansas City Public School District. I started at Southeast High School in the 2016-2017 school year, and that was a really big year for Southeast. For those of you familiar with our community, Southwest and African-Centered Preparatory Academy schools merged into Southeast. So we're bringing in two bodies of kids. The schools were too small, so we housed them all in one big space, and we were trying to figure out what that looked like at Southeast. We also had a new principal. None of the kids knew this principal. We were just kind of a fresh start for everyone. But unfortunately, that year got off to a really difficult start. And in the first 10 days of school, we had over 200 suspensions, which equated to over 3,000 days out of school for kids. At the end of that school year, a fourth of our student body had been suspended for some length of time. After that school year, one of our teachers, he's actually a social studies teacher, his name is Reggie Berry. Reggie Berry took it upon himself to step out of the classroom and to figure out a new way for students and staff to work together at Southeast to change this culture, this punitive culture. So he met with a guy named Greg at the Center for Conflict and Resolution here in Kansas City, and they started the Restorative Justice Program at Southeast. The Restorative Justice Program, it focuses more on restoring justice that was lost in a situation, whether it be a kid speaking out against a teacher or a physical altercation or some bullying, and try to right those wrongs and learn from that versus saying if you do X, you'll have this many days suspended or whatever it might be. So it was a work in progress. Reggie actually worked so well that year and so hard that he got funding from the Kauffman Foundation to continue the RJ program at Southeast for 2 more years, and he got another staff member with him. Since they started, those 2 staff members have really changed the culture at our school. They started with a small group of teachers and trained us on how to speak with kids instead of saying, "Why did you do that? Get in the hallway," or "Get out of my classroom." They coached us on 5 questions that we should really focus on talking or asking our scholars and then following up with them. Things like, okay, who has been hurt in this situation and what are their needs? And whose obligations are those, and who has a stake in this situation, and what is the appropriate process to make sure that things are put back or put right. And the small group of teachers started working with scholars to see if that helped change the culture, asking kids, who do you think was impacted by your outburst versus go home and sit for 3 days and then come right back to school without having spoken to anybody whom you've harmed. And so I wish I could bring you all to school, and maybe I can send you the digital link to join us, but I wish you could see the way that this has changed the culture at our building. We have gone from those 2 staff members to 3 schools using restorative justice. We, for the first time ever, have 2 interns at 2 middle schools to help start this process at a younger age, and then hopefully by the time they get to high school, we're all speaking the same language. And the offenses have gone down 54% from that terrible 16-17 school year to the 17-18 school year, and it keeps going down. There are still some things that, staff members aren't quite sold on, or people may wonder, can kids just give us lip service and then they get out of their punishment? Sure, there are always ways to fudge the system, but what's really cool is the two staff members who had this at Southeast started student ambassadors. So students are wearing t-shirts that say RJ Ambassador, and they can hold circles for kids to sit. Like, I vividly remember two young ladies who really wanted to tear each other's faces off, and they went to an RJ ambassador and asked for a circle and sat in with a staff member, the RJ ambassador, and these two girls, and just talked it out in this safe space in the room. Another thing that helps keep the peace is that if there is a physical altercation, students do have to be sent out of school for a certain amount of time. That's just how the district works right now. But it's not go home for 10 days and come back. In those 10 days, the kids have to complete this restorative process. I keep referring to circles, but those 5 questions I was talking about, then they have to go and sit in on a time with a staff member whom they may have heard, or a parent who was impacted by all of this. And if they kind of pass through that circle after those 10 days, they are welcomed back into the school. But at the start of each hour, they have to approach their classmates, and apologize for what they've done and ask if it's impacted any of them and how they can help. And for a teenager to stand in front of their kids and say, hey, I really messed up. I'm really sorry that I acted that way. I've been gone for 10 days and I'm really behind on my work, but I'm here to try to make amends. Can I help anybody with that? It's just a sight to see. So it's still a work in progress, but it's starting to help this idea of cancel culture. You do this thing, out of there. You can't say that, to restoring some justice. And then the goal being for the kids to take that out into the world and have those practices, hopefully, once they graduate. So thank you for letting me share that.
Katie, thank you so much. And I wish you could see the scrolling comments that are happening right here on Zoom. This story, when Katie and I talked about this, was about a week and a half ago or so. I just kind of sat there and sat back in my chair. I was like, this is unbelievable. And I went into it with all the cynicism and like, come on, like really changing culture takes time. But the more that I started to hear the story, not only was it inspirational, but it was getting results. And I want to emphasize one thing as a follow-up to Katie's story, and that's that the path takes more time. Punishment is easy and swift and quick and gets people out of your face. But when we, and I want to just validate, when we reach the I don't know what else to do moment, it is a legitimately painful moment to reach. Another method might be necessary, some time apart might be necessary. And I know I've deleted Facebook from my phone a few times. I've taken a break from watching the news. There's some healthy boundaries that you can put into place that aren't about canceling and not about punishment. But we have to go back to what are we going to do with a world that needs to grow, to change, to learn, and to right its wrongs? Cancel culture is not an effective long-term solution, either on the big scale or on an interpersonal relational scale. What is something better to do? That is on us to figure out. Katie, thank you so much for sharing that. It's still an inspiration to me, and I know that there's a long way to go, but man, I'm so glad that you get to be a part of the change here at this time. At the end of the day, the status of our hearts is what is most important. And Jesus sets this beautiful example of love, grace, forgiveness, and patience. And I want to leave you before we go into our breakout rooms with a little script excerpt from the movie. It's one of my favorites. It's called The Interpreter. And this is a fictional story. It's a fun little thriller if you ever get a chance to see it. And the story's fictional, and the place and people in Africa is all made up. But it's inspired by a philosophy of African culture. And there's a beautiful story right in the middle of the movie that I have always found really beautiful and inspiring related to this. And so here's the excerpt from the script. And this is a scene between Sylvia Broom, who is an interpreter at the United Nations, and the FBI agent that is investigating her, trying to find kind of some chink in the armor and see if she's got some nefarious intent. So I just want you to sit back for a second while I read you just this short little stories that she tells. Everyone who loses somebody wants revenge on God if they can't find anybody else. But in Africa, in Matobo, the Ku people believe that the only way to end grief is to save a life. If someone is murdered, a year of mourning ends with a ritual that we call the Drowning Man trial. There's an all-night party beside a river, and at dawn, the killer is put into a boat. He's taken out on the water and he's dropped. He's bound so that he can't swim. The family of the dead then has to choose. They can let him drown, or they can save him. And the Ku believe that if the family lets the killer drown, they'll have their justice, but they'll spend the rest of their lives in mourning. But if they save him, if they admit that life isn't always just, that very act can take away their sorrow. Vengeance is a lazy form of grief. So I know I covered a lot of ground right now. And I have to tell you, just even processing it, this story and these things have become very personally reflective for me in how I engage with my interpersonal relationships, how I engage with my past, how I engage with the online world, the public world. And I think this reality that we're living in is keeping us in tension. But I think there's something beautiful in the heart of the gospel that really can continue to give us hope and peace and continue to challenge us to love. And like that verse in Romans said, to engage in aggressive forgiveness and aggressive grace.